The headline says Trump put Cuba on notice. The quote says, failing nation. But I'm watching something else entirely. I'm watching how a single phrase, delivered at exactly the right moment, transforms a regional event into a strategic signal that echoes across 3 continents. The story isn't just about Maduro's capture. It's about who gets to define what failure looks like and why that definition matters more than the event itself. Here's what actually happened, stripped of the drama. According to publicly available reports, Venezuelan opposition forces allegedly detained Nicolas Maduro in a coordinated operation that appears to have caught both Caracas and Havana off guard. Within hours, President Trump issued a statement referencing Cuba directly, using language that wasn't accidental. Failing nation isn't diplomatic boilerplate. It's a specific term with specific implications in U.S. policy frameworks, particularly when it comes to justifying intervention, economic pressure, or regime delegitimization. So I'm not asking what Trump said. I'm asking why he said it this way, why now, and what machinery gets activated when that phrase enters the official record. Let me show you the gap between the narrative and the receipts. The narrative, as framed across most major outlets, presents this as a reactive statement, Trump responding to a fast-moving situation in Venezuela by warning Cuba not to interfere. That's the surface read, but the receipts tell a different story. First, the timing. Maduro's alleged capture didn't happen in a vacuum. It followed weeks of reported back-channel communications between Washington and certain Latin American governments, increased satellite surveillance over Venezuelan military installations, and a quiet but measurable shift in how the State Department briefed allies on Caracas. None of this appeared in the initial headlines, but it's all part of the public record if you track congressional testimonies, think tank briefings, and diplomatic cables released under Freedom of Information requests. Second, the language itself. When I compare Trump's statement to previous presidential rhetoric on Cuba over the last 4 decades, failing nation appears in a very specific context. It's the same phrasing used before economic sanctions packages, before shifts in diplomatic recognition, and before what the foreign policy establishment calls enhanced pressure campaigns. It's not descriptive language, it's operational language. It signals intent. And that intent isn't aimed primarily at Havana. It's aimed at a much broader audience, domestic voters who want to see strength, regional allies who need reassurance, and global actors, particularly China and Russia, who are watching to see how Washington responds when a client state collapses. Third, the mechanics of the rollout. I'm tracking how this story moved through the information ecosystem. The statement was released late afternoon Eastern Time, perfectly positioned for evening news cycles. Within 90 minutes, talking points appeared across aligned media channels, all using nearly identical framing. Trump warns Cuba. Failing nation faces consequences. Maduro's collapse exposes Havana's weakness. The synchronization isn't proof of coordination, but it reflects a well-oiled system in which messaging moves faster than analysis. And that's the point. In modern political communication, the first frame often becomes the permanent frame, regardless of whether it's accurate. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Let's examine the evidence behind the failing nation characterization. According to data from international financial institutions, Cuba's economy has been contracting for 3 consecutive years. Tourism revenue, the island's primary hard currency source, remains below pre-pandemic levels. Remittances from the Cuban diaspora, traditionally a stabilizing factor, have declined due to tighter U.S. restrictions and economic pressure on Cuban-American families. The energy grid experiences rolling blackouts. Food shortages are documented by independent observers and corroborated by satellite imagery showing reduced nighttime illumination in major cities. By conventional economic indicators, Cuba is indeed facing severe structural stress, so the factual basis for calling it a failing state exists, at least in material terms. But here's the part the narrative skips. Failing compared to what? And failing according to whose metrics? When U.S. officials deploy this term, they're not conducting a neutral economic assessment. They're activating a rhetorical framework designed to justify policy escalation. In international relations scholarship, the failed state designation has historically preceded intervention, whether through sanctions, covert operations, or direct military action. Somalia, Libya, Afghanistan all were labeled failing or failed before significant U.S. involvement. The label doesn't describe reality. It constructs a permission structure for action. I'm also watching who benefits from this framing. Domestically, Trump's base responds positively to tough rhetoric on socialist regimes, particularly those in Latin America. Florida, a critical swing state, has a significant Cuban-American population that largely supports aggressive policy toward Havana. By framing Cuba as failing, Trump reinforces his credentials on an issue that delivers both ideological satisfaction and electoral advantage. There's no scandal in that. It's standard political behavior. But it's worth noting that the timing of this statement coincides with early positioning for future electoral cycles, not just immediate crisis management. Regionally, the statement serves another function. It sends a message to every government in the Western Hemisphere that maintains ties with Havana. If Cuba is a failing nation, then association with it becomes a liability. Countries like Mexico, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, which have maintained diplomatic and economic relationships with Cuba despite U.S. pressure, now face a choice: align with Washington's narrative or risk being perceived as enablers of a failing regime. The statement doesn't demand compliance. It shifts the cost-benefit calculation for neutrality. On the international stage, particularly in Beijing and Moscow, Trump's language is being read as a test case. Both China and Russia have invested heavily in Cuba over the last decade, providing economic lifelines, infrastructure financing, and military cooperation. If Washington successfully redefines Cuba as a failed state and uses that designation to justify further isolation or intervention, it establishes a precedent. The message to Beijing and Moscow is clear: your client states are vulnerable, and we will use their economic fragility against them. This isn't speculation. It's consistent with how great powers signal resolve in competitive geopolitical environments. But let me offer the counterframe, because this is where analytical credibility lives. To be fair, there's a strong argument that Trump's statement is neither particularly strategic nor carefully calibrated. It could simply be reactive rhetoric, the kind of off-the-cuff commentary that characterizes his communication style. In this reading, failing nation is less about activating a policy framework and more about projecting strength without a detailed plan. Skeptics of the strategic interpretation point out that previous Trump-era statements on Cuba, Venezuela, and other Latin American issues often failed to translate into sustained policy shifts. Rhetoric doesn't always equal action. Additionally, some analysts argue that labeling Cuba as failing is counterproductive if the goal is regime change. Publicly humiliating a government entrenches its domestic position by allowing it to rally nationalist sentiment. Cubans, even those critical of their government, may resist external pressure framed in such confrontational terms. History shows that siege mentalities strengthen authoritarian regimes rather than weakening them. From this perspective, Trump's statement might actually extend the Cuban government's lifespan by giving it a clear external enemy to blame for internal failures. There's also the question of enforcement. Declaring Cuba a failing nation means nothing without follow-through. Does the U.S. have the capacity or willingness to escalate sanctions further? Are their coalition partners in Latin America prepared to join a coordinated pressure campaign? Or is this another case of rhetorical maximalism with minimal policy backing? The gap between what's said and what's feasible is often where credibility erodes. If Trump's warning produces no tangible consequences, it risks becoming just noise, one more data point in a saturated information environment that treats bold statements as background static. Now let me pull back and look at the second-order effects. If this narrative, the failing Cuba narrative, becomes entrenched, what happens next? First, it accelerates economic isolation. International investors, already wary of Cuban exposure due to legal risks and sanctions, will interpret failing nation as a red flag. Capital flight intensifies. Credit lines dry up. The economic spiral that the term describes becomes self-fulfilling. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural observation about how language shapes markets. Second, it deepens political polarization within the Cuban diaspora and among Latin American governments. Hardliners will see Trump's statement as validation. Moderates will see it as reckless provocation. The space for pragmatic engagement narrows. Diplomatic channels that might facilitate incremental reform or humanitarian relief close down because any interaction risks being framed as collaboration with a failing regime. The policy conversation becomes binary. Support regime change or enable failure. Nuance disappears. Third, it raises the stakes for Havana's external patrons. If Cuba is visibly failing and Washington is loudly declaring it, then China and Russia face a credibility test. Do they increase support to prevent collapse, thereby demonstrating that their partnerships are durable even under U.S. pressure? Or do they quietly reduce exposure to avoid being tied to a sinking ship? Either choice has costs. Escalation invites confrontation with Washington. Withdrawal signals unreliability to other client states. The dynamics here mirror Cold War logic, where peripheral conflicts became proving grounds for superpower resolve. Fourth, it sets a precedent for how the U.S. addresses left-leaning governments in the hemisphere. If the failing nation framework succeeds in isolating Cuba, it becomes a replicable model. Nicaragua, Bolivia, potentially even Mexico, under certain political conditions, could face similar rhetorical treatment. The long-term effect is the normalization of delegitimization as a tool of regional policy, not through covert action, but through sustained narrative construction. And once that norm is established, it's very difficult to reverse. But here's the detail most coverage skips. I'm looking at the specific phrasing Trump used, not just failing nation, but the context around it. According to transcripts, he linked Cuba's status directly to Maduro's alleged capture, implying causation. They propped up a dictator, and now they're failing. That's not just description, it's attribution. It assigns blame. The mechanism here is straightforward. If Cuba is failing because it supported Maduro, then other nations supporting authoritarian regimes are on notice. The logic extends beyond the Caribbean. It touches every relationship where a government provides economic or military support to a controversial regime. Iran's support for proxies in the Middle East, China's backing of North Korea, Russia's alliance network in Central Asia. The language creates a template: support the wrong side, and you'll be labeled next. I'm also watching the media's role in amplifying or challenging this frame. In the first 48 hours after Trump's statement, major outlets repeated the failing nation characterization without consistently interrogating its basis. Some included economic data supporting the claim, others treated it as self-evident. Very few asked the deeper question: what policy mechanism does this language activate, and what are the legal and diplomatic implications? This isn't an accusation of bias. It's an observation about how breaking news cycles prioritize speed over depth. The frame gets set before the analysis catches up, and by the time critical questions emerge, the narrative has already moved on. There's also a curious silence around what happens if the premise is wrong. What if Maduro wasn't actually captured? What if the reports were exaggerated, misattributed, or entirely fabricated? I'm not claiming that's the case, but in an environment where information moves faster than verification, the possibility exists. If the inciting event turns out to be less definitive than initially reported, does the failing Cuba narrative collapse, or does it persist independently? Historical precedent suggests the latter. Once a geopolitical narrative achieves critical mass, it becomes resistant to correction. The frame outlives the facts. Let me give you the incentive map, because this is where the machinery becomes visible. Trump's political team benefits from projecting dominance on foreign policy, especially in Florida-adjacent issues. The defense and intelligence community benefits from increased budget justifications tied to hemisphere security. Media outlets benefit from high engagement content that plays into existing partisan divides, whether pro or anti-Trump. Cuban exile organizations benefit from rhetorical validation of their long-standing positions. Regional competitors of Cuba benefit from its further isolation isolation, opening space for their own influence. Even some humanitarian NGOs paradoxically benefit, as failing state narratives often unlock funding for relief and democracy promotion programs. On the other side, Havana's government benefits from the external threat narrative, which justifies internal repression and economic hardship as necessary sacrifices against imperialism. China and Russia benefit from positioning themselves as reliable alternatives to a U.S.-led order that weaponizes economic distress. Anti-interventionist voices in the U.S. benefit from a clear villain to rally against, and certain commodity traders benefit from market disruptions that the uncertainty creates. I'm not suggesting conspiracy, I'm mapping interests. When you see who gains from a particular framing, you understand why that framing persists, regardless of its accuracy. Now, here's the mechanism I find most revealing. The phrase failing nation does something very specific in the grammar of American foreign policy. It sits between two other terms, rogue state and failed state. A rogue state is threatening. A failed state is helpless. A failing state is something in between, still dangerous enough to justify attention, but weak enough to justify pressure. It's the perfect designation for a target you want to destabilize without triggering the legal and logistical burden of a full intervention. You're not invading a failed state. You're not deterring a rogue state. You're accelerating the collapse of a failing state, and that acceleration can be framed as humanitarian, economic, or strategic, depending on the audience. I'm also tracking how this plays domestically. Polling data, where available, suggests that American voters broadly support tough rhetoric on authoritarian regimes, particularly socialist ones. But support drops sharply when that rhetoric translates into military action or sustained financial commitment. The failing nation frame threads that needle. It signals toughness without promising deployment. It satisfies the base without alienating moderates wary of intervention. And it allows the administration to claim success regardless of outcome. If Cuba collapses, the policy worked. If it doesn't, well, they were warned. The ambiguity is strategic. But let's examine what's not being said. I'm looking for the gaps, the questions major coverage isn't asking. First, what's the end game? If Cuba is failing, what does the U.S. want to happen next? Regime change, humanitarian intervention, negotiated transition, or simply prolonged instability that keeps Havana too weak to project influence? The statement doesn't clarify, and that ambiguity is either a feature or a flaw, depending on your perspective. Second, what about the Cuban people? The economic data shows real suffering, food insecurity, medical shortages, infrastructure decay. Does labeling the nation as failing help or harm ordinary Cubans trying to survive? The humanitarian question is rarely central to the narrative, but it's the most morally significant one. Third, what's the legal basis for further action? Failing nation isn't a recognized category in international law. It doesn't trigger automatic sanctions, intervention rights, or coalition obligations. So what practical authority does it create? Or is it purely rhetorical, designed to shape perception rather than enable specific actions? And fourth, what happens if other nations reject the frame? If Mexico, Canada, or European allies continue normal relations with Cuba despite U.S. warnings, does that undermine the strategy or prove its necessity? The interdependence of modern geopolitics means unilateral framing often fails without multilateral buy-in. Here's where the timeline matters. Maduro's alleged capture, if confirmed, represents a seismic shift in regional power dynamics. Venezuela's collapse would remove one of Cuba's last major economic and ideological partners. For decades, Caracas subsidized Havana through discounted oil shipments and trade arrangements. Without that lifeline, Cuba's already fragile economy faces catastrophic pressure. So Trump's statement isn't just commentary, it's positioning. By declaring Cuba failing at the exact moment its primary patron falls, he's framing the narrative in advance. When Cuba's situation worsens, as it likely will, the story will be, "We told you so," not "We contributed to this." But the timeline also reveals something else. Why wait until after Maduro's reported capture to issue this warning? If Cuba was failing before, why wasn't this language deployed earlier? The timing suggests that the statement is less about Cuba's actual condition and more about seizing a rhetorical opportunity. Maduro's downfall creates a window where aggressive language carries less diplomatic cost. Allies who might have objected to harsh anti-Cuba rhetoric when Venezuela was stable are now more more likely to stay silent or even agree. The moment shapes the message as much as the message shapes the moment. I'm also watching the international legal dimension. Under current U.S. law, Cuba remains subject to extensive sanctions rooted in statutes dating back to the Cold War. But failing nation isn't a sanctions category. It doesn't appear in Treasury Department guidelines or State Department policy frameworks. So what happens next? Does this phrase become the basis for new executive actions, expanded sanctions, tighter travel restrictions, or asset freezes? Or does it remain rhetorical, a signal without immediate enforcement? The gap between declaration and implementation is where policy either gains teeth or loses credibility. Let me give you the counter-narrative that's emerging in non-Western media. According to outlets in China, Russia, and parts of Latin America, the failing Cuba story is being framed as American opportunism, exploiting a neighbor's vulnerability rather than offering assistance. This version emphasizes historical U.S. interference in Cuban affairs, from the Bay of Pigs to decades of embargo, arguing that if Cuba is failing, Washington bears significant responsibility. Whether you find that persuasive or not, it's the narrative competing for attention in much of the global South, and it carries weight in regions where U.S. interventionism is viewed with suspicion. The Chinese framing is particularly instructive. Beijing's state media frames Trump's statement as evidence that the U.S. prioritizes domination over cooperation, that Washington seeks to control rather than coexist. For audiences in Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Middle East, that narrative resonates because it aligns with their own experiences of Western pressure. The failing nation label in this reading isn't analysis. It's imperial branding, marking a country for subjugation. I'm not endorsing that interpretation, but ignoring it would be incomplete analysis. Narrative battles aren't won by the most accurate frame. They're won by the frame that best aligns with the audience's existing beliefs. So here's the escalation scenario. If the failing nation narrative sticks and policy follows rhetoric, we're looking at intensified sanctions, reduced diplomatic engagement, and potentially covert operations aimed at accelerating regime change. Cuba responds with closer alignment with China and Russia, accepting deeper economic and military integration in exchange for survival. That integration gives Beijing and Moscow a strategic foothold 90 miles from Florida, the exact outcome U.S. policy supposedly aims to prevent. The paradox is that aggressive framing might produce the opposite of its intended effect, pushing Cuba deeper into the arms of U.S. adversaries rather than isolating it. Alternatively, if the rhetoric doesn't translate into action, Cuba's government uses the external threat to justify internal crackdowns, economic failures get blamed on American aggression, and the status quo persists with even less room for reform. Either way, the Cuban people, the ones actually living through the economic crisis, end up bearing the cost. That's not unique to this situation. It's a recurring pattern in geopolitical standoffs where governments on both sides prioritize positioning over people. Now let me bring this back to the core question, the one that matters more than any individual fact. If the narrative needs this much rhetorical reinforcement, if failing nation has to be declared rather than observed, if the framing precedes the evidence rather than following it, what's really being constructed here? Is this an accurate description of Cuba's condition, or is it a strategic designation designed to justify predetermined policy? And if it's the latter, does that make it less effective or just more dangerous? Because here's what I'm seeing. The phrase failing nation entered the record. Media repeated it. Analysts debated it, but very few asked whether the designation itself serves a function independent of its accuracy. In narrative mechanics, there's a concept called performative language, statements that don't describe reality but create it. When a president declares a nation failing, markets react, allies adjust, and adversaries recalculate. The declaration becomes a fact through its consequences, not through its correspondence to pre-existing conditions. And that's the mechanism worth understanding. Modern geopolitical communication isn't primarily about conveying information. It's about constructing frameworks that shape behavior. Trump didn't say Cuba is experiencing economic difficulty. He said failing nation, because one invites sympathy and the other invites isolation. The word choice isn't accidental. It's operational. And once you see how that works, once you recognize the gap between the language and the reality it claims to describe, you start asking different questions. Not, is Cuba failing, but who benefits from saying it is? Not what happens next, but what was always going to happen, and how does this narrative justify it? That's the story. Not the headline, not the quote, the machinery underneath. And if you're watching closely, you'll notice that machinery doesn't stop with Cuba. It's running everywhere, all the time, in every story where language does more than describe. The question is whether we keep treating these statements as information, or whether we start treating them as what they actually are, instruments of power dressed up as observations of fact. Because once you see the difference, you can't unsee it, and that changes everything.